So it's about 7 o'clock. I will start now. Good evening and welcome everyone to this very important webinar of Thailand 2020s and beyond, building a resilient society. This event is hosted by joint partnership between IPPD, MIT, Thai PBS, and EIU. And I am Natha Gomonwabin from Thai PBS World and anchor from Thai PBS. I'm very honored to be moderator of this webinar session. And this event remarks the launch of IPPD and MIT research partnership on societal risk, resilience, and governance, which combined multitude disciplines. And there are multiple viewing channels that you can join this webinar, like Facebook Live, Zoom webinar, and you can access through QR code and link here. You can see right here on the screen. The webinar will also broadcasted on the Thai PBS World Live right now on Thai PBS World and Thai PBS as well. And please look forward for your engagement. All the team are looking forward for your engagement, and your questions are most welcome, and you can send any questions to us. And we also have a poll, and you can participate in real time. And please keep a close vote, because we would love to hear comments from you. And here is a schedule for tonight for the webinar, and we will open with part 1, introduction of IPPD and our partnership with MIT on the topic of risk, resilience, and governance. Then Dr. Saurabh Kiatpongsan, Managing Director of IPPD, will share his welcoming remarks. So there are so many exciting things to look forward to tonight. And part 2, very important, is the keynote session. IPPD is very honored to have such an esteemed keynote speaker to be joining us tonight. Stefano Scurati, Regional Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit. He is very much an expert on public policy, and he leads a team of public policy specialists and economic across multiple geographies, supporting clients through public policy engagement and programs, policy design through leadership from Economist Intelligence Unit. The second, Professor John Fernandez, founder and director of Urban Metabolism Group from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Professor John E. Fernandez is at the MIT, and he specialist in environmental solution initiatives, and he is founder and director of the MIT Urban Metabolism Group. Third, Kun Pitchapha Jula, Principal Investigator at Institute of Public Policy and Development. And she has received master degree in city planning from the MIT in 2018. And she also got international program in design and architecture from Chulalongkorn University. And fourth, Professor Miho Masario. She's Director of Urban Risk Lab, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's an Associate Professor of Architecture and Urbanism at the School of Architecture and Planning at MIT, and the Director of the Urban Risk Lab at MIT. So that are the 4 distinguished speakers that you'll be listening to tonight on the panel discussion. And first part of the event, now let's hear a few words from Dr. Saurabh Kiatpongsan, Managing Director of IPPD, to share his view on and welcoming remarks on introducing partnerships with MIT. Please, Dr. Saurabh.
Sawadee My name is Sarapop. I'm a managing director at IPPD. On behalf of all hosting partner tonight, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome everyone to the webinar. We are very excited about the program today with a few reasons, right? This is together with our partner, our very first international event. It's also very timely to talk about risk and resilience. And tonight we have global thought leader with us. And also this is not only one-time webinar, but it's also a beginning of our journey to better understand risk and resilience. Please allow me to start and warm you up a bit by asking this simple question. We're thinking about future, right? And we're thinking about Thailand in the future. So what kind of a society we want Thailand to be, right? We can come together and then build the one we want, right? Shall we build Thailand to be a rich society, right? We want Thailand to be a rich one. Well, the answer might be probably yes, right? And then probably we want Thailand society to be a happy one, right? The answer probably be yes again. Probably be a safe one, right? So, well, we might need to define what safe society gonna be, right? And then in this era of the knowledge economy, Thailand 4.0, we might say that, well, we might want Thailand to be an intellectual one, right? With climate change and things, we might think about building Thailand to be a sustainable society. I would say that, in fact, IPPD have organized with partners two conferences on intellectual society and also sustainable society. Tonight, we would be focusing on resilience. And we like to invite you to think and talk about resilience with us tonight. As we know, resilience is not really about rescuing, surviving, right? But it's also about ability to adapt, to adjust, to recover through risk and hazard, right? And hopefully becoming stronger and better. So it's not just survive and rescue, but also about thrive to thrive as well. Please allow me to take a quick 1-2 minutes to talk about IPPD. So IPPD is a policy lab with a mission to promote long-term development of Thailand. And we believe that we can build a better society through better policy. And when we're talking about policy, we're talking about development. We're usually thinking and talking about growth, right? Earlier this year, this is pre-COVID-19, our institute set up a project called the Beyond Growth Project because we think that growth is important, but it's also important to look beyond growth, right? So what do we mean when we say beyond growth? This is the meaning of this is we should look beyond just economic growth. There are multi-dimension of growth. And also we should look beyond macro level of growth, like macroeconomic growth in the aggregate, just like one number like GDP or GDP per capita and the growth itself, right? So let me show you this simple cartoon or diagram, right? Sometimes when we're talking about growth, we're just thinking about a linear growth, right? But we all know that with this COVID situation and thing, growth is no longer linear, right? It's volatile and it not really in a linear thinking form. What I love is the thing that the growth lab at Harvard Kennedy School proposed. They show that we should acknowledge the fact that growth can be quite complex. And by acknowledging this complexity, we should be better to manage growth and also be able to build a better society as well. In order to do so, we are very fortunate to have good friend and partner to build a better society, build a more resilient society together. Last year, we worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit and work on a study to look at resilience and risk at the city level. And tonight, Stefano would be joining us presenting and sharing key insight from the study. Also, we would be very happy to say that we so fortunate to work with Professor John Fernandez and his group at MIT. I had an opportunity to meet John both in Boston and also here in Bangkok as well pre-COVID. John gave us many good tips and advice, and his presentation today would show us how deeper understanding of urban metabolism would allow us to build a more sustainable and more resilient society. In addition to working with John Fernandez and his group, we would also be very fortunate to be working with Professor Miho Masiril and her colleague at the Urban Risk Lab to better understand the role of participation and engagement on risk and resilience. And let me say that besides working with both John and Miho on the research project, we are very fortunate that they are very kind to be our advisor at the Institute as well. And let me go back a bit and say that we initially think that IPPD should be a policy lab, right? But after working with John, with Miho, and with Stefano, we learned that something is missing here. It's not about just policy and about lab, but it's also about perspective. So please allow me to introduce our very own principal investigator here, Professor Pishapa Jula, who's also Professor Miho's student, graduate from MIT and also a Fulbright scholar. She would be sharing her thought and hopefully change the way you think and look at risk and resilience. And let me conclude by saying that we really hope that you will enjoy the program tonight. And let me be a little bit nerdy here, since we're working with the MIT team, to say that may the force and power of perspective and partnership be with us all, and let us build a more resilient society together. Thank you all. สวัสดีครับ
Thank you very much, Dr. Saurabh, for your enlightening introduction, especially towards the end that you would like the force and partnership be all with us, especially in this seminar. I'm sure that will be very fruitful discussion from our distinguished speakers. So let me move on to hear from our participants. And here's the poll. So please get yourself ready to join the poll. How prepared are you to take on future risk on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not prepared at all and 5 is extremely prepared? You can vote through the link in the comment box of your current channels, or just type sli.do on the browser and fill in the event name #TH2020s Resilient Society. No sign up, no login required. We just want you to participate in this polling. And we will keep the poll open until we finish all the keynote sessions. So you will have more than an hour or so to join this polling, because we would like to hear your view of how well we prepare for the future. So now we will start with the first speaker, Stefano Scatri, Regional Director of the Economist Intelligence Unit, and he will share with us his findings from IPPD and EIU collaborative study on urban resilience among ASEAN countries and the key gaps commonly found. So please take your floor, Professor Stefano Scatri.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be with you tonight and to present the study. I would like to thank Dr. Saurabh and IPPD for the opportunity to work on such an important topic. So if we can go to the first slide, Asia is on the front line of climate change. And we can see two different phenomena happening at the same time. On the one hand, you can see increasing frequency and intensity of what we call sudden onset disasters. So we're talking about flooding, typhoons, tsunamis, storms, and so forth. And you also have mounting risk from what we call slow onset disasters, for example, rising sea levels. Now, we know that Asia is very exposed to extreme weather events, and this is largely due to its geographic positioning. However, we also know that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. In fact, all disasters are man-made. I once was speaking with a practitioner, and he explained to me that you can have an extreme weather event, but if there is no assets around it, it's just an extreme weather event. It becomes a disaster when there's a destruction of assets or human lives. So urbanization, of course, plays a really important role in this narrative. And when we think about resilience in the context of urban resilience, cities are, of course, the lens through which we look at the issue. Now, Asia has one of the highest rates of urbanization in the world, and it boasts more than half of the world's megacities. And the reason why disaster risk is such an important issue in ASEAN is that many of its cities are actually poorly built. And so this generates two issues. One, it increases the risk that cities faces, and two, it makes disaster risk management an especially important feature. We also know that cities are and have been the most important engine of growth in Asia. So a lot of the initiatives and action that you can take when you think about resilience in the context of climate phenomena, you need to be thinking about cities first and foremost. So next slide, please. So we conducted a study in which we aim to help the community within the policy domain to think about some of the building blocks of disaster risk resilient cities. A few years back, the Economist Intelligence Unit did a program for what was then called UNISDR and now is known as UNDRR, in which we looked at what are the building blocks of national level readiness when it comes down to disaster risk resilience. Now, for all the reasons that I outlined earlier, as we were speaking with Dr. Sorapov, we came to the realization that there was a really important area for investigation, which is how do you apply a similar way of thinking to the urban context because of the importance that cities have in terms of development of countries around the world and especially in Asia. So we developed this study which combines city level resilience scores with qualitative insight from experts. We look at 5 cities in ASEAN, Bangkok, Ho Chi Minh City, Jakarta, Kuala Lumpur, and Singapore. And we assess them across 5 different categories. These 5 categories are broad areas that define the key pillars of good disaster risk management. And these are number 1, institutional framework, number 2, disaster risk reduction policy, preparedness and response, number 3, economic resilience, number 4, societal resilience, and number 5, resilience of the physical environment. So we took this broad structure and we adapted it to assess individual components of resiliency at the urban level. And so our analysis really aims at identifying development areas for individual cities. So we started covering 5, but also learnings that really apply to all cities in the region. So I'll spend the next few minutes just talking you through what we looked at, and then I'll close the presentation by giving you some high-level findings that cut across all the cities we considered. Next slide, please. So the first area that we looked at is what we call the institutional framework. So what we measured here, what we assessed here, are elements such as the existence of dedicated subnational institutions that are responsible for disaster risk management. We looked at the operational effectiveness of these institutions. This is an important learning that will come back in a few minutes. You can have perfect institutions in place, but it's really important that they are actually able to discharge their mandates. So in this case, we look at staffing and the ability that these institutions have to do what they're set up for. Number 3, we look at the support from political leadership. We know that is absolutely critical in terms of mobilizing investments and facilitating policy reform. And we looked at the existence of monitoring and evaluation plans and frameworks. So essentially, this constant interaction of the policy community with the built environment and constant assessments of what's the situation that the city or countries deal with. Next slide. The second area that we looked at is the RR policy, preparedness and response. So here, the key issues that we try and look at are whether cities are building with disaster risk-informed development plans. We look at their ability to respond in the occurrence of a disaster. So here it's about funds set aside for disaster response, but also investment into preparedness. We look at preparedness under the lens of the existence of early warning systems. And lastly, we look at contingency planning. As you can see at the bottom, there are some scores from the cities. I'll come back to them. Just keep an eye on those, and I'll draw a few highlights from those. Next slide, please. The next domain that we looked at is economic resilience. Now, today we're talking about resilient societies, and you can see in the way this assessment framework is structured, the importance that we attached to resilience when we think about disaster risk management at the urban level. So 3 out of 5 domains really focus on this element. The concept behind economic resilience is pretty straightforward, and it's the idea that once you're hit by a disaster, having good finances and good financial processes set up is going to help you bounce back faster and more effectively. So here we look at macroeconomic stability. We looked at the diversification of the economy. We know, for example, that countries that are highly dependent on agriculture, which is a sector that is very prone to disasters, are going to face strong levels of migration within cities towards cities that increase pressure on the overall system and challenges around mobilizing funds and ensuring that the tax base is supported if a vast part of their GDP is in a disaster-prone sector. We looked at catastrophe insurance availability at the city level, and we looked at the poverty levels overall. Of course, wealthier societies are, all conditions equal, going to be better placed to bounce back. Next slide, we looked at societal resilience. So the idea here is good levels of social cohesion make it easier for cities to bounce back when and if a disaster strikes. So here we look at levels of public safety. Of course, when a disaster strikes, there's a lot of disorder. So ensuring public safety is conducive to a smoother return to normalcy. We looked at social cohesion, specifically through the lens of income inequality. Here, the idea is that a more equal distribution of wealth signifies a better ability of a city or a country to respond. Of course, healthcare systems is quite self-explanatory. And gender equality, and this is a very interesting angle, but it's a pretty well-researched topic, which points to the fact that more equal societies from a gender perspective are better equipped to bounce back. And the last area, which is probably the most intuitive to most, is the resilience of the physical environment. So here we look at the quality of the existing infrastructure. We look at the resilience of the so-called critical infrastructure. So your airports, bridges, key highways. So elements of the built environment that a country or a city absolutely needs to be able to function. We looked at the implementation of building codes, and here you see a theme coming back, which is this idea that it's not enough to have good laws and regulations. You actually want to see that they are applied. And lastly, whether cities conduct exercises to identify their own vulnerability, risks of disruption. So here we look at whether there is scenario planning processes that are being conducted and general monitoring of exposure. Now, onto the next slide. These are 5 key takeaways that we identified. I promised I would say a couple of words on how cities scored. So I will do that, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, it's probably more helpful for us to think about across all cities, what are some of the learnings and what are some of the issues that policymakers in ASEAN can consider. So 4 of the 5 cities that we considered were scored as mature, developed. These are the higher tiers of our scoring system. And scorecard shows that there's some engagement with disaster risk management in all cities. I would Singapore ranked as mature, Ho Chi Minh, Jakarta, and Kuala Lumpur ranked as developed, and Bangkok ranked as emerging. So Bangkok showed within our sample of 5 as the city which has the most to catch up on. Now, first key finding that cuts across is that economic and societal resilience are weak across cities. Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, for example, they have high proportions of people working in the agriculture sector, which can be seriously undermined by climate catastrophe. So it goes back to the point I was making earlier. And generally, catastrophe insurance is not all well adopted. Overall, most of these countries present a pretty high level of societal inequality, which again we identified as a key area of vulnerability. The second key takeaway here is that there is a significant gap between policy and practice. So cities often produce disaster risk modeling, but they do not integrate this meaningfully into future planning. So for instance, urban building codes often contain disaster risk restrictions, but these can be ignored, and this happens all the time in cities, especially in ASEAN. There's also a lack of procedural clarity sometimes during disaster events. A good example from the past, which one of the experts that we interviewed as part of this project flagged, is in the context of the 2011 floods in Bangkok. There were over 20 different departments which had some responsibility to respond to the disaster, but there is no clearly allocated responsibilities, which resulted in coordination challenges. So these areas which are around the transition from high-level principles to actual operational application are extremely important in this space. Another point that we highlighted is the fact that political support exists, at least in public statements, but that remedial actions actually tend to be focused on what practitioners call hard fixes. So you very often see a disaster striking, and the response is strong in terms of political statements, but the statements tend to focus on things like dikes, artificial islands, seawalls, so infrastructure remediations that unfortunately are expensive, take a long time to deploy. And so timelines, cost, logistics mean that often these fixes tend to fail to materialize. So what experts call for is actually more holistic measures, such as disaster-informed spatial planning, greening of existing infrastructure, or wetland restoration. So this idea that there is some forward-looking planning that can happen now. We don't need an extreme weather event or a disaster to strike to action. And so in a way, this puts emphasis on the fact that really disaster risk management and urban resilience more broadly is something that we should be thinking about on a constant basis rather than just in the aftermath of a disaster. The business community and civil society can cooperate to drive urban DRR efforts. So this again is a critical point that emerged from this research, is that disaster risk management needs to be thought holistically. So holistically from a time horizons perspective, what can we do today that will put us in a good position tomorrow, but also if something happens, what is the ideal solution to respond to a disaster? The same thing applies when we think about engagement between community, businesses, and society. So the idea here is that, when, for example, we build an infrastructure project, activities do not worsen disaster dynamics, right? So this is very true when we think about buildings or infrastructure investments. How is their impact going to be calculated when we think about disaster dynamics overall, not just as the built environment, but at a societal level? Last key point that I will focus on is this theme of technology. All cities that we looked at are leveraging technology and data to increase disaster readiness, and this is an extremely exciting and fascinating area of development. I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from the next speakers. But technology plays a critical role in disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management, and this ranges from social media platforms all the way to sensors and imaging tools that identify risks such as flash floods. So the 5 cities that we looked at all show some level of engagement in this area, And this reflects Asia's wider embrace of the opportunities that are brought by data and technology. And we can only expect this to increase in the era of 5G and the Internet of Things. So overall, the piece on technology is one that offers incredible opportunities. It's one where all the cities we looked at we're paying very close attention to. I think the key overarching theme that emerged from this research is that these issues must be looked at in a cohesive way, in a systemic way. So technology in itself is not the end of the response strategy. It needs to be looked at a much wider level when we think about how to make a broader, the broader society disaster risk resilient. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefano, for sharing with us your valuable research. It also shows us that it has to be working in tandem between the government policy or at the top level and to be working on the ground as well to try to have resilience for the future society. And up next, we are very privileged to have Professor John Fernandez, founder and director of Urban Metabolism Group, UMG, from MIT. He's here to share the importance of urban metabolism and its role towards sustainable urban futures. So please, Professor John Fernandez. Probably we will have to wait for Professor John Fernandez to take his turn of sharing with us his research on urban metabolism and especially the importance of urban metabolism.
Can you hear me now?
Role. Yes. Okay. So
Okay.
please take your turn.
Okay. Sorry about that. Don't know what happened. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you to Natal for the very nice introduction, and thank you, Stefano, for that very nice comprehensive overview. It's interesting to see the work, and of course, thank you to IPPD and Dr. Soropop for the invitation. So I'm going to be talking about urban prosperity, and again, Stefano's presentation really keyed up the major themes here, but prosperity under global uncertainty. I'm going to be using the work. If we could put up the slides, please. I'm going to be talking about the work of the Urban Metabolism Group. Would you like me to share my slides? I can do that. Okay, so I will be talking about the work of my research group at MIT. And explaining the work that we do in the service of long-term resilience. I can share my slides if that's preferable. Is that what you'd like me to do? Yes? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Okay, can you see that? All right, great, thank you. So now we're off to the races. So the group is called the Urban Metabolism Group because what we do is we assess the resource requirements of cities, and the resources, physical resources, energy, water, food, materials, is the basis for understanding, first of all, how unsustainable a city is. In other words, how resource intensive the city is in terms of the kinds of physical assets that are needed to run the urban economy. but also give us a very good idea about its long-term resilience. So resilience, in the way that we talk about it in my group, is the ability of the city to continue operating under great uncertainty. And the situation that we're in today is that our infrastructure, our supply lines, our systems, our protocols, our procedures, our policies, our governance is all based on the expectation of a stable climate, the expectation of being able to accurately predict large-scale weather events, long-term supply line dynamics, the supply of food from agriculture, the supply of energy. And we are now entering into a period, we are in a period in which instability has to become part of the way in which we think about cities and everything that's required of cities. The particular work that we do has to do with resources, so physical resources. So urban metabolism is a study of the resource requirements of cities. The primary method that we use is to account for those resources, literally to count them as they enter into the city, understand how much is coming into the city and how it's being consumed. And any definition of urban sustainability has to include a rigorous assessment of the physical needs of that city. We know now through this pandemic that very quickly the strains on supply lines for physical resources can become an enormously important challenge when the expectation of business as usual in terms of supplying those resources and also the economics behind business as usual is very much strained under great uncertainty. The reality here is that the cities in Asia and Africa are not only going to be at greatest risk from climate change, but they're also going to be playing the central role in addressing climate change through mitigating greenhouse gas emissions and also serving their populations, their exploding populations, in ways that doesn't lead to massive social strife. So the work that we do is essentially provides pathways, guides on how to achieve aggressive targets of deep sustainability for humane and livable cities. And Dr. Soropop at the beginning introduced a number of different metrics in which to think about this in terms of what would produce a prosperous future is not just about the income level of households. It has a lot to do with livability. It has a lot to do with the expectation of being able to plan for the future, not only individually, but as well as households, neighborhoods, and the entire city itself. So a little bit of background. In the 20th century, the human species crossed two momentous thresholds. On the left, you see a graph that shows that global society has gone from substantially renewable materials to non-renewable materials in the last few decades. And on the right, we know that now half of the human species now lives in cities. We're an urban world. The challenge is to consider how prosperity can be redefined under climate change. And we know that on a decadal level now, at a decadal timescale, we need to reduce by half our greenhouse gas emissions beginning now. That amounts to a 7% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions annually. It's extraordinarily aggressive reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And consider this, that between now, 7.7 or so billion people, and 2050, the population of the world is going to increase to 9.7 billion. At the same time, what I just outlined as the challenge for greenhouse gas emissions, essentially on a decadal level, more or less needs to be halved every decade. So that's a 30% global population increase, at the same time requiring an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so how do we translate that into the urban context? So this is a figure, a graphic of Bangkok from a recent paper in Nature Communications, showing what we previously believed to be the climate change induced flooding in blue in Bangkok, and the urban population in gray. The recent analysis has shown that we underestimated that climate induced flooding, and this is now the new estimation, peer reviewed general consensus estimation on climate induced flooding in Bangkok. And of course, this goes for many coastal cities. So let me talk about Bangkok, both in terms of the past and in terms of the future. In terms of the past, there are enormously valuable lessons about how societies used to plan for disasters, natural disasters, and develop resilience using the urban form. So in Bangkok, don't have a lot of time to go through this, but in Bangkok, the notion that the city itself would receive the flood waters and manage them under dire conditions. So on the top there, you have two images, Bangkok today on the left, and on the right, Bangkok really is a city of water. It's a city of, used to be a city of canals. And there's a really interesting future vision in which one begins to incrementally go towards a transformation of the city, so that on the lower right, this is Lagos, Nigeria. It's a city of water. On the lower left, this is New Orleans under flooding after Katrina. And the question for us is, do we want to begin to very, very steadily look to accepting this uncertainty from climate change in the form of the city and the infrastructure, and simply accepting uncertainty as part of the way in which we think about infrastructure, building systems, procedures, protocols, emergency response, and everything else. And looking to the future, the difference between that past image of Bangkok as a city of water and today's and future Bangkok is we now have an enormous universe of technologies that can be applied to understanding the real-time metabolism of the city, not only in terms of energy, but in terms of water, precipitation, food flows, material flows. And we are approaching a real-time understanding in which the city respires, knowing, understanding and how it consumes materials and how it serves the needs of the population. And that technology can be a guide to the future to really bring new ways of thinking about planning and design and procedures and protocols for emergency management to a more resilient city. I also want to introduce one other topic here, and that is we also know much better than we ever did the global impact of cities on large-scale Earth systems. So we've done now some work, and this is a large part of the work that we're doing for Thailand, but also for other cities around the world. What is the relationship between urbanization, the growing city, how it grows and how much it grows, and its effect on Earth's systems? This one in particular, this slide is analyzing, beginning to parse, to understand the different elements of biodiversity that are affected directly from the growth of cities around the world. And there's some very, very interesting work that is getting us to a point where we can now understand how cities affect much larger scale, much larger systems beyond their borders. And therefore, then we can begin to manage that, because it's really, really important that we begin to apply policy towards the understanding that we're gaining, the very rapid understanding that we're gaining of the effect of cities on biodiversity, on natural resources, and the climate system itself. We've started this work in Bangkok, and we are doing an accounting, and we're quite far along in an accounting of the resource flows in Bangkok. And we're looking forward to the future work in the next couple of years, and looking forward to keeping everyone informed about how we're proceeding. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor John Fernandez, for your very insightful research on urban metabolism, especially on Bangkok, and you show us how uncertainty the city is facing, and especially what would be innovative way to try to maintain sustainable development and sustainable future for Bangkok as well, which is very insightful. So now we have about 15 minutes of panel discussion. So I'd like to extend the discussion to Stefano first. So overall, how do we measure resilience from your research?
Yeah, good question. Difficult question too. I mean, from our perspective, so I can give you maybe a little bit of visibility on my learning process as we thought through this this framework. My initial vision was a very linear one, right? So you prepare for a disaster strikes, you respond to disaster, you bounce back. So it's a very, very linear flow, which actually is not the way in which practitioners look at the issue. So for us, you know, resilience is measured as the ability of, in this case, a city to bounce back to a shock event. As mentioned, we structure it along three pillars. There's other ways in which you can cut it. There is different weight that you can give to the three pillars. But yeah, for us, as I was mentioning earlier, it's when we think in this context, it's the ability of the economy to bounce back. It's the ability of society to bounce back, and it's the ability of the physical environment to be rebuilt back better, ideally. So to us, that's the three pillars that we use.
And what would be identifier of the economic impact or societal impact to try to increase resilience of any city?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I think there's a number of concepts that come handy here, right? I mentioned one earlier. Economic diversification is an important one, right? So if you think about how a city is connected within the context of a country, and the city itself is struck, what is its dependency on other segments of the value chain outside of the city, the better integrated a city is, you can argue the more resilient it is, right? So it's a matter essentially of building spare capacity around the city and in neighboring cities, so that if one bit is hit, the city can still survive because it can lean on other geographies, be it cities or rural areas. A second element that I would look out for is actually a very macro element, which is the overall financial stability of a government. Right, cities are still parts of countries, and a lot of the budgets when a disaster strikes and there's need to build the city back or respond to disaster, comes from national sources. So the overall financial health of nations is a big predictor of economic resiliency. And I would say if I need to pick three, the third would be actually the depth of the insurance market. This is an absolutely critical element of resiliency. It's really hard to insure against disasters at the aggregate level. I mean, you can get home insurance, but when it comes down to insuring assets worth trillions, it becomes incredibly difficult because the risk of the disaster striking is very low, but if it does, the economic impact is enormous. So there is still a dearth of financial mechanisms to insure very large, expensive assets. So this is something that the international community is looking to address through public-private partnerships and other blended financial models. But to me, that's a very substantial area of economic resilience that has a long way to go before we can say that it's working effectively.
Thank you very much, Stefano. And right now you are watching webinar on Thailand Beyond 2020, Building Resilient Society. And right now it's discussion with the distinguished speakers who are presenting on resilience and metabolism in the how to deal with uncertainty of any city from Professor John Fernandez. Professor Fernandez, you mentioned that Bangkok shouldn't accept uncertainty. Can you extend your argument on this, and what can Bangkok do more in order to cope with uncertainty?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It's a very good question. So maybe I can put some nuance into what I was saying before, which is that I think we need, at the highest level of our understanding of the era that we're in, we have to make a cognitive shift. We all understand more or less that we have an expectation of a stable climate. And so a superstorm for us today will become a normal event in 15, 20 years, not because it's necessarily, there will be more storms and all that, but that will happen, but that we will simply become, we will expect it. It won't be a surprise. So the cognitive shift that I'm talking about is that disasters, I think Stefano mentioned this in his presentation, disasters are really only disasters when you haven't prepared for them and don't really have the systems in place of every kind, physical and non-physical, to be able to continue operating before, during, and after. And so the expectation of large-scale events, extreme heat events, superstorms, climate-induced flooding should simply become the new normal. That has to be the way in which we think about planning. That has to be the way in which we think about prosperity as well, because I think that it's a real mistake to say that prosperity is going to suffer. And again, I'm using prosperity in the broader term: happiness, expectation for your life, expectation for your children's lives, your standard of living, of course, but other things. Your environmental global citizenship, I think, is going to become a part of prosperity. How do you feel about your relationship to the planet? And that sense of prosperity has to accept and embed uncertainty in the way we think about all the physical and non-physical systems of the city. So for example, we've been working with a number of cities to define resilience clusters or resilience sub-districts within cities that are resilient. So cells, urban cells. In other words, it's too much for us to expect that a city, large city, 10 million, and in the future 50 million, 88 million, Lagos will be 88 million in 2100. It's too much for us to expect that city to respond collectively as one unit in the future. It's really much more important for us to think about how might we create subunits within the city that have an embedded resilience at the neighborhood level, at the district level. The issue with that is understanding. So how do you then collect the resources that are needed, store those resources and distribute them within that district? So what kind of electricity storage do you have? What kind of water harvesting? What kind of even food production do you have? And that kind of like cellular resilience in cities, especially when cities are becoming plus 50 million people, that kind of resilience is an important way to think about planning in the future. And so I think the sense that I'm trying to communicate is that uncertainty is simply going to be the certainty of the future. It's simply going to be embedded within the way in which we think about how cities should operate under a whole range of conditions.
Yeah, you remind us all with new normal. It's buzzword nowadays with COVID-19, and it's very strong reminder that we are living with uncertainty with COVID-19. So overall, do you reckon that we actually, all the population of every country has to prepare in terms of their mindset to deal with uncertainties in the future, not only allocation of enough or sufficient infrastructure, but mindset and to deal with it in
Absolutely.
subunits.
Absolutely, because one of the things, I mean, I'll say that on balance, the physical systems, the infrastructure, even the supply lines, that's going to be the easy part, frankly. We will be able to, with the appropriate amount of investment, plan cities so that they can contend with a massive flood event, if that flood event is becoming a regular normal event, right? It will take many decades, lots of investment, but cities will do that. The physical part is actually the easy part. The social and cultural and economic parts of a shift in mindset are the difficult part. And when I say a shift in mindset, that uncertainty should also be considered when we're moving towards greater equity in cities. We cannot decide that we cannot deal with the issues that we have in income equality, housing equalities, equality in our justice systems, because we have to deal with the physical. We have to make sure that the city isn't getting flooded. The mindset has to bring along all of those priorities equally and simultaneously, so that at the end of the day, as we're contending with uncertainty in urban situations, that we are heading towards a more humane future, that we're not deciding that, oh, it's really problematic, we have climate change, it's just going to be worse in the future. That's a real mistake, I think. It's got to be that we're always have our eye on a trajectory of developing more humane, more equitable, more physically resilient, safer cities. And again, I think that's the mindset, which is not only, it's challenging, certainly, but I want to also say that it's really exciting. I mean, we're in the 21st century, a century of cities in which we have the opportunity to shift our cities towards a new normal, which is better than our current normal. And I think that's really the goal that I have in mind in my work, and as I work with students, to have that sort of sense that that's what they can contribute.
But how do we deal with fundamental in terms of physical readiness or like social infrastructure? Because it doesn't mean that every group of people in society have the same power level to deal with this aspect. Yeah,
so I mean, the income is the best indicator of your ability to weather an extreme event right now, right? So, the resilience in many cities is tightly correlated to your income level. What I was suggesting before is, in my presentation, is that there are ways to think about the city broadly as part of a larger context, as part of a natural context of flows. Of course, in Bangkok, the water, the hydrological cycle is an extremely important flows, but other flows, food flows, energy flows, in ways that we recover some of what we used to think about in planning cities, so that those systems, those flows can serve the broader population more equitably. I'll give one example. The ancient Roman and Greek planners, there's Vitruvius and other writing. When you read about city planning, there are passages about how to situate a city so that it's situated in a favorable way to the prevailing winds, to be able to clear out the heat of the city in the evening. Now we do that with computational fluid dynamics. But the fact is that, that kind of recovery of sensitivity to the larger dynamics within which cities are situated, because we're not going to move cities, but we can certainly situate them better into ecosystem services and green and blue carbon mitigation strategies and lots of other things that will overall benefit the population of a city and not favor one population over another. I think that's one major part of, and I could go on for another couple of hours, but I think I have to stop there.
Thank you very much for keeping your time, because we are all reminded that the time is up for the discussion round for this round. Thank you very much, Stefano and Professor John Fernandez, for your food for thought and your argument from your research.
Thank you.
And before we move to the next speaker, it's a gentle reminder to you all that you can participate in polling. The question is, how prepared are you to take on future risk on the scale of 1 to 5? You can vote through the link in the comment box of your current channels, or type slido, sli.do on the browser with this hashtag. And we will look at the results towards the end of the discussion. And now let me move to the third keynote speaker, Ms. Pichapa Jula, Principal Investigator from IPPD, to share her findings on risk, resilience, and governance, particularly its relevance to cities and people. So please, Ms. Pichapa.
Thank you very much, Mata, and also thank you very much for all the speakers before me. I feel completely honored to be among all of you guys today, and from on the behalf of IPPD as well. So I'm just going to go on and share my screen now to move on to the second part of the presentation. Okay. So hi again. Good evening and maybe good morning from all across the world if you're watching somewhere not in Bangkok. But I would like to actually emphasize that I think the discussion part that we just had and what Stefano and Professor John was just talking about is really completely the fundamentals of how we look at disasters and resilience in general, but also the prosperity and also the growth of the people. So I really do appreciate the conversation, and I think there are a lot of things to connect. And most importantly, thank you, John and Stefano, very much for laying down a very big, general framework in which why we say or talk about risk in the first place. So I think my perspective for today, I'm just going to be giving on the behalf of the IPPD team to share with you today risk, resilience, and governance through the lens, as the title suggests, of the complex complexities of cities and people. So, but first of all, I think we need to scope down a little bit. We have seen an overview of how risk resilience domain has been looked at the international level and all across the world. What are the exciting innovations and how we should look at risk, right? But I think we also need to know how risk has been talked about at the international level, but also how Thailand actually talk about risk. I'm going to really scope it down from the global perspective to really our national level here. So of course, having very vast and complex framework, risk can be categorized in a very clear themes and domains, right? So it's also made it easier, much easier for us to understand how to manage them in each of the domains. And also we can look at them through different values or lens of values, right? So that also goes back to the decision of what values do we trade off when we actually talk about risk. But just earlier this year, before COVID arrived, just in 2020, the World Economic Forum has just declared for the first time in decades, right, that the world thought leader has perceived that in a very recent and coming years, environmental risk will become or inflict the most impact on our lives and also cause consequences that is very long term. As for Thailand, the varying degrees of the impact and patterns of these environmental risks can be seen as flood, drought, and forest fire. As COVID is going on, and also amplifying the different stories that is being materialized on the ground with actual people in it, right? So when you really think about this, the different places actually tells a very different stories of how impact, what kind of severity, what kind of story people are actually experiencing on the ground, right? At the ground level is very different from how you actually look at risk from the above level. So as we adopt the world view into the national level of Thailand, we might have missed, this interconnectedness between the risk and between the ecosystem and the risk, and also the risk and the people. But also, lastly, how to really manage across borders and the governance in order for us to ultimately reduce this vulnerability to create and build resiliency. So I think in this very talk, I will be picking just on one very particular type of risk as our case studies, and also provide you a deep dive example. The next question is, I'm going to pick on flood risk, right? My next question would be, if we put flood risk in perspective, how are Thailand actually dealing with risk? Right? So if we scan through a numerous voices in media, we can see now a very, very strong perceptions towards very long overdue and unresolved trouble that persists in Thailand. So the way in which large institutions and government agencies give their best attempt to really handle flood risk might not actually respond to what's happening on the ground or what the actual communities might have needed. Mismanagement from institutions many times have caused the public to lose trust and hope, and also that expectations can sometimes turn to blame, and it becomes a very common sight and common mindset every year that floods hits Thailand. So many times, the measures that we have put forward as an institutions are quite reactive from the public's perspective instead of being proactive. So huge investment, as we hear, even though it's very important and necessary, but huge investment are right now relying so much on hard and rigid infrastructures that really responds to the event onset. This costly investments continues to actually create a cycle of perceived reliance from the people and the community for always seeking for external aids and capacity. But I think tonight we want to flip that perspective a little bit, as John has already laid out the foundation to the mindset. Today, what I would like to talk about is how do we flip that perspective and the discussion in a much rather simpler term, right? So I don't want to look at risk as challenges, as a villain, but rather look at risk as challenges and how we can really reflect and use that as an opportunity to reflect on our own capacity that leads to actions and decisions that we could make in advance. But also another point is when we look at risk in each of the domain and silos approach, we forgot a completely different, a completely critical driver, which is the people and the context that both John and Stefano has touched on. Right? So the people and the context varies, and they are embodied with different values and perception, and that's become the complexity that we need to talk about and start to really string back when we talk about risk. So neglecting vulnerabilities will be costly, as repeated episodes of flood will exhaust tremendous resources, right? Both on human capital and budget, as well as increasing reliance on external help from the government. So our preliminary studies further tackles the vulnerable groups within Thailand to see where they are and who they are. If we look at the aggregate level at first, we want to see where this vulnerable people is located, right? So if we look in 2016, for example, 9% of the population was already living under poverty. As John was just saying, income level was a good indicator as a baseline, right? Especially in the north, in the northeast, and in the south. But also we have to look, whereas in 2017, we have to look at the change in demographics in that as well. There is currently an average of 1 dependent per every 2 working age population at the national level. And these includes the proportion of children aged 15 and under, elders aged 60 and over, and disabled people requiring a caretaker to the number of working age population. But what does this mean, right? It means that we can foresee working age populations as a very important source of assistance to these vulnerable groups. So this is a critical factor very much to capture the existing capacity on how people and human resources and us as a country can respond and deal with risk. So neglecting people in the context and as a centerpiece of the planning and management for any disaster will suffer in the long run. How we are going to look at this, I'm going to bring you 2 different cases of studies so that we can really touch on the ground what's happening at the level of different cities and people. So in Bangkok, for example, the urbanized growth polls concentrated very much in the city centers. And of course, many valuable businesses, assets, infrastructure congregated within the very hard lining of the flood wall protection, which is lined in blue line here. Right? So you can see, if you look on the right-hand side, the flood risk, repeated flood risk area of this map actually tells us a lot of things. There are a clear division between the area which is being protected and the area which is surrounded and are repeatedly suffering from floods. Right? But also within this perceived safety, those who are not experienced flood has a very different kind of mindset than those who experience flood. So conflict in planning in this area, for example, such as the location of high value infrastructure, like the Don Mueang Airport, right, is neglecting or even not looking at the overlook the flood prone conditions. So the entire airport was submerged in water in 2011. Land use planning and of course zoning becomes a very much critical area to start talking about how we locate and start preparing our city towards flood. But also costly damages to all the urban infrastructure ripples the livelihood of the people as well, such as working day losses, affected GDP and the economy. So the news and report and media also track flood-prone areas, mainly focuses on the street, right, that potentially delay commutes to the productive work environment. But also on the other side of this flood wall, right, is possibly not the most inclusive solution for people on the ground. From the research, we see that highly flood-affected districts at the periphery of Bangkok are concentrated with vulnerable populations, including low-income housing and workers. So without planning and protection, ad hoc and troublesome response emerges as a use of sandbag that keeps one side of the lining dry, but the other really highly flooded. Flood is no longer just risk, but it's a rising dispute over inequality and trade-off, right? Who gain and who losses, it becomes a geopolitics. So the community located here, you can see that the dense urban area is very much different from how the community perceives it. But also with our collaborations with YSide Thailand social media listening platform, we also assess the risk perception of urban residents through voices in media. So the media actually focuses so much on waste and the trash management, but also focuses largely on the ineffective hard infrastructures, and secondly, the government responsibility that are reactive. So as a city become more detached and disintegrated from the resources around it, such as the canal, the government also increasingly responded with much hard engineering solutions, right, such as large drainage infrastructural investment. There are less reflection on spatial planning, of course, and the zoning law regulations. Therefore, if we look at the vertical governance of how risks are managed or disaster risks are managed, the structure you can see right now, it's overlaying of agency and different kind of responses, right? There are still very much ways to integrate this ecosystem more dynamically than what we see in this one. But just as the flood wall keeps the inner city dry, it also keeps Bangkok unequally drier than other provinces as well. So the next step, we actually look at the Ubon Ratchathani area, which is the very upcoming rising second-tier city, where we see a dual kind of growing tension between urbanization and rural agricultural areas. So the responses are actually a bit different from what we see in the urban centers of Bangkok, for example. Also, the demographic is very different, looking at the vulnerabilities and the dependent population of over 33%. We see that right now, the government are being blamed again through the social media and voices that peaks during 2018 when Ubon Ratchathani suffers from tremendous loss in flood. The social safety nets and the government failure of ineffective budget allocation to really reach the farmers and the vulnerable villagers has been talked about so much. But then there is also this interesting emergence of using technology such as phones and social media to garner key influential responses and collective responses to rally for donations. It's also revealed a little bit of the trust issue as an underlying structure here. So in Ubon, people's perception towards risk mitigation tends to actually shift to role models and key influencer rather than relying on the government and centralized management. The last example that I wanted to give is actually a very, very small mid-sized city called Hatnong community in Untitled province. This province lies in the confluences of the Chao Phraya River, which suffered the same 2011 flood that lasted for about 3 months at the 4-meter height, the entire 3 months. So what I would like to assess and describe to you today about this community is that it has a very different mindset and contrastingly radical, is interesting approach to deal with flood. So the research undertook with extensive documentation living with the community to assess and identify the social and governance structure of how they manage community-based flood and resource management. So within this province, you can see that there are some of the wise work being captured here that recognizes that they are recognizing the importance of adaptation and capacity buildings. Over 1,000 clips and interview transcription has led to a very few clear repeated words, right, and interpretation that connects their values together as a community. So the core insight from the research observes shared mindset for constant adaptation, leadership, and self-governing attitude. They also focus on the development that embrace and adopt risk as a natural state of mind. So most importantly, they also consider well-being in this management of risk at the beginning. So they are interestingly caught up in cultural elements such as food and freshly cooked meal that people were proud to say that they have, a very substance-basic during crisis. Risk here is being perceived beyond losses. They have shifted target to stay thriving amid uncertainty instead of just dealing with risk. So in translating this into actions, the attitude also carries through the transformative actions and proactive communications on the ground. So of course, there are like four different kind of categories in which we could start looking at how they translated this action onto the ground. The database and dynamic knowledge regeneration through co-creation of risk mapping and coupon for food, or even fresh food delivery system, creating a communal kitchen and delivery to each of the household throughout all 3 months. And the medical care and delivery system that start the daily check-in with the medication to vulnerable people's elderly. So the public health center as a community space become the vital important element. But that thereafter, there is this adaptation or wholly shift or a paradigm shift towards collective plots. So they started this rice calendar and water user association to keep the season, to shift the entire agricultural and seasonal rice farming to earlier when flood arrived. So they entirely shift the conventional practice towards a new paradigm. Also, there are all the governance, and if we see this entire structure as a dynamic kind of responses, there's always a two-way communication that has always been played in. Right? And each of the actors has a very clear role and also knows that rules are not rigid and it's ever changing in the face of crisis. But as a summary, we can also see that there are a very interesting component and important components of leadership, lifestyle, community, well-being, healthy mind and body, but also livelihood and economy as well. But more than that, they build trust, values, and perception in order to create a co-creative livelihood and economy at the end of the day. My concluding thoughts for today for risk, resilience, and governance is to say that the paradigm shift in the mindset is very fundamental first step for disaster risk management in Thailand. So we need to build a society that really moves from institutional reliance to individuals and community self-governance. This will shift focus from government-led approach to people-centric approach and proactive solutions on the ground. So lastly, this is why it is important for us to actually look beyond growth, right? Sorry about this, but this is one of our team members on the slide here. So this is why we're looking beyond growth, and the 3-year research is aiming to build foundation in order for us to prepare for the future development that are adaptive and actionable. Our team here conclude with the happiness and well-being, but also looking at risk, resilience, and governance as an interplay and complementary element to each other. I think I'm actually running a little bit over time. So thank you very much. And I'm cutting off now. Hopefully we have more discussion at the end.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pichapa, for your insightful research on how to keep society informed with the risk and how to work on the ground, especially to keep well-being of society and use people-centric approach, which seems really important to tackle with risk facing in any society, especially in Thailand. So now let me move on to our last keynote speaker, Professor Miho Maseril, Director of Urban Risk Lab, URL from MIT. Professor will share with us how to build a resilient society with collective intelligence. So please, Professor.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my slides now. Thank you very much to Dr. Soropop for the invitation and IPPD and the whole team for putting this together. And of course, the Pim who just presented this great segue into this next presentation. So thank you. It was already discussed a little bit in terms of the different hazards within Thailand, seismic, landslide, flood hazard, and drought. Just to think about the PM 2.5, that's another piece that will be on part of our project consideration. And then because it's so topical and something that has been brought up already a number of times, it is important to discuss current COVID-19 situation. But I have to say that in Thailand, there has been a lot of great success that this COVID diagram here really shows what Pim was already talking about in terms of communities coming together and everybody working together to pull down this curve. This was a piece of a project by Vipapi in Disaster for Design and her team at InfoAid. And they were sharing and delivering PPEs to hospitals, this project. But what I'd like to talk about with this is really the idea of coping capacity, and that this coping capacity really exists in Thailand. And the key is to not compromise that. So this image on the right-hand side is taken from Ben Wisner's book, At Risk, which talks a great deal about hazards and vulnerabilities, but also talks about the necessity of developing more coping capacity within, within neighborhoods. So it's really about caring for society collectively. So if we go back to COVID, wearing a mask isn't necessarily only for you, but it's really to protect others and those who are most vulnerable. So we need to understand these latent inequalities within society. And so it's about this collective strength, right? And as I mentioned, Thailand showed with their COVID response that this collective coping capacity really exists. And also Pim's case studies that she just showed. And the key point is to not lose that. The other is to really understand traditional and vernacular approaches. Remember that this existing knowledge is there, and to value landscape strategies. Other strategies, which you might find humorous now, plant and animal behavior used to be really strong indicators for heavy rains and floods. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, I'm not going to listen to a buffalo when I can actually have alerts come to my phone. But my point is that we can't rely only on technology. A country that's quite close to you, and in Stefan's assessment would rank very, very high in the maturity catalog, but the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, there were a lot of lives saved through preparedness, but many of those who died, there was an over-reliance on government, on predictions of wave height, and technology and hard infrastructure of seawalls. So people who didn't see the ocean pull back or who ignored the earthquake shakes and didn't evacuate quickly relying on technology, many of them passed away. So we don't want to rely just on that. A lot of people worry that we've lost our ability to read topography, understand watersheds, and understand ecological systems. We don't want to compromise on this. We need both very clearly. So in the lab, when we talk about resilience, we talk about community resilience. And we borrow this quote from Susan Cutler, the University of South Carolina. She says, community resilience is the ability to plan, prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse effects. And so how do we do that? We really try to listen first. And this is another quote that we use often. It's from Eric Ofterheide. It's more effective to learn what people tend to do naturally in a disaster and to plan around that rather than to design your plan and expect people to conform to it. So to talk a little bit about the structure of the Urban Risk Lab and highlighting a few projects along the way, we are largely architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, but we do a lot of workshops and education. We have emergency management in the team, as well as computer science and human computer interaction, but then ethnography. And ethnography is a really important piece so that we cover and acknowledge all of the things that I've been talking about until now. So similar to PIM, we've also done a number of these kinds of workshops where we map evacuation routes, we map the immediate risks, the flood risks, but for a long time, they were all on paper. So when you're really engaging the community, how do you do this in a quicker way? How do you transform this into a digital image without taking it home and taking 2 weeks to come back to them so that this discussion can be on the fly. So since then, we've really started developing a number of tools. So these are all created in the lab. We want to create tools to add new data easily so we can do this risk mapping digitally. And then how do we create tools to then analyze the data easily? And so how can we do this also in a community meeting where everything is done on the fly and we can have really nuanced discussions about specific places? And then how do we start to analyze invisible data? So this is looking at sea level rise and groundwater rise in comparison to topography within a city. And then how do we create tools to understand the relationships? So all the community risk mapping that's happening is amazing and fundamental, but how do we interconnect them with other risk mapping done in other villages and other communities into the whole watershed system? And how do we then combine those data sets with other data sets that are available? So this is built form and the age of it and storm surge risk. So these are all tools that we've been building within the lab for these purposes of doing these workshops. And what we're constantly trying to figure out is how do we create an active repository for constantly updated data that can be used for creating localized plans. So we've talked a little bit about creating tools and technology that can supplement but not replace local knowledge. And then the next part of the presentation, I'd really like to talk also about connecting residents' efforts to prepare and respond with government efforts to prepare and respond. So as much as we want to turn to and learn from residents, government or top-down institutions have a scalability, they have a coherence across projects. There's ways to insert policy decisions into this, and then there's funding structures. And so it's really important to have both the residents and the top down and the bottom up. And then the other piece that we really work on in the lab is connecting people's everyday needs to resiliency needs through design, so that it's not an additional thing that you have to do in a moment of crisis, but you already know how to do it because you're using it already. So one project, we have many, but one project is this risk map project. This photograph is actually from Bangkok, taken in 2017 by Nation Photo. And it really starts to talk about this social media and cell phone capturing and sharing of information that Pim already touched upon. And so we've been working on this in a few different countries. And because we're not a software company, we're researchers, we really learn from the context and try to adapt and create things specifically for each place. The way that the system works is that we look at what the most popular ways of communicating are and how do people regularly communicate anyway. And so in Thailand, it may be the Line app, which is very popular. We're also doing this in Japan, where we're using the Line app, Twitter, and Facebook. Now, since people are already, as you saw in that photograph, taking photos and sharing these very detailed flood contexts, what we're asking them is to then share that information with us as well, and then adding other geospatial layers. And then there's one side of this that comes to a public map so that everybody can inform each other. And then there's another side of this that comes to the disaster management interface. So this is very quickly just the way that the system works. It's very similar to other things that you may have seen, where you're asked for a location, you're asked for the water height, you're asked for a photograph, some text, and swipe, and you submit. So this is really meant to be not just last mile communication where you're informing people of issues, but pushing information to residents, but it's also first mile communication where you're collecting information from residents and then you bringing that up to a top-down system. And the idea really here is to increase awareness and hope that people, by recognizing and sharing this information, become stewards of their own city. So what happens is as soon as that is submitted, it goes instantly to a real-time map where all the blue dots are the information that people have submitted. And the yellow is once the government has verified the information in the area. And the yellow changes to different degrees of water height according to the government standards. And so many of our projects, we see that when people wake up in the morning and they're looking to navigate through the city, as you can see, this image here says over 1,000 users per minute that they use this platform so that they can navigate safely through the city. And we're excited that we get very, very specific information that we would not be able to get from a satellite image or any kind of large top-down system. For example, the top image says, open manhole, proceed with caution, where people are warning each other of these very specific things that only people on the ground would know. We've been extending this project to also look into post-disaster assessment cards. And so before the government can come to a location to assess the damage, people can already be uploading and sharing this information directly, especially things that are dangerous. In Japan, we've continued beyond flooding into road closures, debris, and landslides, and many other things as well. And the road closure one also connects it to the everyday, right? So that this everyday instances of traffic issues can also be reported through this. And so again, as much as possible, connecting everyday uses to resiliency uses. And then, as I mentioned, it is not just a platform for people to reach out and share to each other, but it really intended to be a connection, a conduit between the top down and bottom up, and not a one-way thing, but a two-way. So we've been developing these dashboards for the emergency operations centers. This is one that we did for Kumamoto, Japan. And it is starting to also look into how many people are in which shelter and how crowded each of these shelters are. As you can imagine, this is especially important during these COVID times when we need to reduce the number of people in shelters, which means we're going to have more sheltering options, which means we'll need more coordination. And so having this be online and easily accessible is something that is especially important this year. And then because we have both images and text coming in, we're starting to do this automatic tagging of images so that there isn't this information overload for emergency managers. And then that they're alerted when there are peaks within the flood events. So this is a project that we call Reducing Risk Together with Collective Intelligence. And I'd like to just end with sharing a few more slides. I have a few more minutes. So this is just to re-emphasize that although we build all these tools and they're all technology based, we do other projects too that are designed and built, but the ones that I'm sharing today are technology based, but we want to make sure that it is used as a tool and a way to share and coordinate plans and to enhance awareness, but it has to build upon existing knowledge and local methods. And as John was talking too about this new normal, in the lab, we always talk about being part of this timeline, that somewhere in the country, you're in different parts of this timeline. And so it's always important to believe that it is a cycle and to always be prepared to make sure that the preparedness, both in terms of government to citizen connection, but also citizen to citizen connection is live and something that everyone is always working on. So the other piece is that resilience needs to be considered holistically. I think this is repeating a number of sentiments from the other people who've spoken to. And so while designing the built environment and respecting natural systems, we have to make sure to care for society collectively, especially the vulnerable populations. So with that, I thank you. You're the experts, so I'd love to hear from you and learn from you as we design these new projects together. And so I'm excited for kicking off this collaboration today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nicole, for sharing your research on collective research and try to build up the weapon against resilience or the risk that society is facing. And it's very fascinating to show us how collective information can measure and can pave the way for resilient society. And so far, what's the loophole or what's the obstacle for people to share information or to contribute to collective information?
So I think part of it is technology. That's part of the solution. I think that in terms of, so I talked about it in terms of data sets as one situation, and then in terms of personal experiences as the other. And I think in terms of data sets, it is difficult to coordinate. And then there is quite a bit of territoriality and there's quite a bit of siloing. And so different professions, different organizations, different government organizations sometimes are reluctant to share to create this larger database. But I think that is something that we can get over. And we can also start with having these smaller scale risk assessment projects come together in a collective database. And that's one way to start.
And who should be the main organization to have this collective intelligence? Should it be government or independent organization?
I think a collaboration would be ideal. I think that the nature of combining top down and bottom up is really important, so that there is a structure to work within. And we want the government to respond and react also, and so that the collaboration between the two is really necessary.
Okay. So, and Ms. Pichapa, would you like to extend or to compare with to Thailand in terms of collective intelligence, because you have been collecting lots of information on many provinces in Thailand as well, and try to encourage local community or people-centric approach to have resilient society.
Yes, thank you for those questions. I think that from our perspective, it's really about how to bring all this knowledge that all the speakers has been talking about, both at the global and international perspective, and through the tools, the new technology, and really bridges that with the context of Thailand, right? And I think as we already mentioned, I think in Bangkok, it's one thing, right? But also in other provinces, the way that people access technology, the way that institutions and ecosystem enables people to access technology, but also access other resources are very different and diverse. So I think that just to extend or expand beyond that, I think that the first fundamental baseline to really look at risk collectively is also to understand how each and the contextual society start thinking about risk. First of all, how do we shift their mindset towards a risk-informed or risk as everyday part of the life, right? I also think that maybe just to connect back a little bit to what John has said earlier, and which very interested me, was how do you look at, it's more like how do you decentralize the system in a way that it could maybe recollect it at some point and really rejoins as a bigger picture. So this urban cells, right? How do you prioritize and where do you prioritize to empower the resources and or also the way that risk is being managed, and to what people? In order to do that, I think we need to assess, first of all, the capacities at the level of the community and of course the enabling environment around it. So that would be my responses for how do we move on really from towards a more collective society.
And Professor John, the empowerment of individual and subunit community seems really important. And what do you like to reckon for each individual or each unit to try to empower themselves and to shift mindset and to build up resilient society?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think that question relates to something that Professor Mazareu also mentioned, and that is that you really want to build on what people do normally. You don't want to impose top-down rules or structures that people will have to adopt and then adhere to, because we all know, I do this personally, that confronted with a set of rules, one of the first things that you do is you try to game those rules. And what I mean by game is you try to adjust your behavior or adjust or bend the rules to in a sincere way to sort of serve your own best purposes. So I want to answer on two different levels. On the individual level, I think that what people normally do is they are citizens of a city, but really maybe even more strongly, they're citizens of a neighborhood. Anybody who's lived in a large city, and I've lived in several, knows that many large cities really are collectives of neighborhoods. And so, living in New York City, I knew better the people on my block, within a 2-3 block area. I'd say hello to them in the morning than I did when I lived in a situation where, you're living in a single family home and you're detached from others. I think that so building on that, so there's the technology and the infrastructure, the physical systems of resilience in neighborhoods, the things that I mentioned before. But then there are the social networks, the information systems, and the kind of collective will to act as a community, which I think we should think about at the neighborhood level. And that begins with the individual, because an individual subscribes to that collective very strongly. The other thing about that is I think the individual understands better the actual physical assets of their particular neighborhood, and also along with that, the risks that exist in their location than anyone else. So they know very well, they see it on a daily basis. Does this particular street regularly flood? Is there a risk of landslide in this particular, and people who live, individuals who live in those areas. So both at the scale of in real time communication of those risks, as Miho described, but also in the long term, having engaging in and participating in the planning for resilience of that location, of that place, relatively tightly bounded as a neighborhood or a district, I think is the way the individual can participate.
So Professor Miho, is that like brand new meaning of neighborhood, especially in the city? Perhaps people do not care much of one another. So to have collective intelligence to build resilient society, it means that community has to be working closely together, and that's new culture as well.
Yes, I agree that the social connections are very, very important for resilience. I think the community and how you define community sometimes gets tricky, as we see that some people get excluded from different notions of community. But I think that there are many different social networks and social systems. And so whether you fit with your neighborhood, whether you feel most connected to an organization that you're part of, there are many different communities that we all interact with and are part of. And I think figuring out where those strengths are and enhancing those strengths are then the most important things.
Stefano, in your research, you mentioned gender equality as well. And how do you see women as a change agent in terms of building resilient society?
It's a tricky question in that we didn't look into that too specifically, but what I can comment on is there is definitely a theme that emerges here around social cohesion, right? Which we measure in many ways. It's around, gender equality is one manifestation. We looked at economic indicators such as income equality. And I think there is softer elements that, a study like the one we conducted could not measure, and very much go in the direction of what Mio and Pim were talking about, right? Which is the softer bounds of community and what keeps them together. So I think, just picking up on a broad theme that everyone highlighted is that it's very hard to think about resilience in the context of the built environment and just focus on these broad categories. And sometimes as researchers, we need to do it because we need to focus on defining a problem, but there's a lot of things that cut across and that add a lot of richness that can be explored. And yeah, I love learning about these, these research efforts, and this whole community piece is something that to me is sometimes it's harder to measure, but I think it's absolutely fundamental and adds a lot to a discourse like this one.
Okay, thank you very much for all your thoughts on how the world society, especially in cities, try to have collective information, collective intelligence, and try to build up resilient society to keep the whole society informed on risk. That seems to be the first step, and the next step is to have information and very much aware of it. I think the next stage of this discussion is about the result of the poll. So now let's take a look at the poll of how prepared are you to take on future risk? And the score is 2.7, not up to 3. So it means that people estimate that our capacity to deal with future risk is about 2.7. Would any one of you like to make more comment on this? What's the
Mm.
interpretation and implications?
What I will say is that, after listening to John and Neo, I would have probably, at the start of this conversation, given it a more pessimistic score. After hearing the type of work that they're doing, I'm feeling more prepared to respond.
Yeah.
Well, so I'll add, that's a very generous thought there, Stefano. The thing is, I'm not surprised because, and to give credit where credit is due, generally people are very well informed. I mean, we're better informed than any human population in the history of the world. And so I think the sense that there are emerging and uncertain and growing risks is widespread. The thing to add here, and I think it's an important part of the message that I'm going to be communicating, regularly, is that the collective ambition to address these risks is not only necessary, but it's exciting. It can lead to a new kind of city, a new kind of world, a more humane future. It's not going to happen, alone or naturally. It's really going to take a concerted effort. And so, I'm hoping that this poll, this is an indicator to me that says that people feel there's a need to know more and to do more and to get to a point where risk and uncertainty is part of a new normal, and that's part of a more equitable world. I mean, that's the message that I'm going to be hammering away, very regularly.
Yeah.
John has a very positive view on that, which is really great. I think the point that we're picking up on risk, resilience, and governance, and actually talking about collective actions here is because I think there's a sense that we embrace this risk nowadays, and I think it's become more prominent to us that we can't avoid thinking about it in our normal everyday life, right? And I think the poll is just a reflection of how people started to assess, what they have and the capacity that they have in order to move forward. So I think there's no right and wrong to say that, we're underprepared now, but the question is, how do we get there to prepare for futurists, right? And I think all of these talks today give us quite a very positive way of thinking about risk and really reshape how we talk about risk for the future. It's not about losses or damage anymore. I think it's more about how do we go forward in a way that we balance both the ecosystem, the resources, the management, and towards a new paradigm entirely. So I do agree that the 1, 2, 3, even though it's lower than the score it should have been, but I think that's also a positive note on how people see themselves within this era.
I'd like to I agree with all of my colleagues here. One thing I'd just add, I'd like to give a shout out to IPPD and Thai PBS, because this idea of doing a poll during this kind of session where people are not just passively listening, but actually asking people to reflect on their own actions and how they think, it's already a great start towards this conversation. So I like this format and wanted to highlight this.
Yes. Thank you very much for all your comments, for the extension of the argument, especially after the polling. It means that we have to work on it to raise awareness on having more knowledge on risk and try to build more resilient society. So right now, I'd like to hand over to Kun Pitsapa for the wrap up of the session. So please.
I will do my best, actually. There's so much to digest from everyone, and I think it's a great message here. But I will go to address, maybe summarizing quite the critical points from each of the speakers, very honorable speakers here with us today, starting from Stefano. Right at the beginning, you have laid a very great foundation, not only for Thailand, right, but for us, where we situate ourselves against the backdrop of the international benchmark. And I think that's very important for us to understand where we are among the world in order for us to start going somewhere. Right? But I think one thing that you picked up on is really, and I think very interesting, is you started off saying that this risk as a start is not natural, right? It's never natural. It's always man-made. And that means that we have decisions to make. We have different decisions to reorganize the metrics or the scoring that you have done in the benchmark of how we are going to prepare for future risk, how our decision now is going to take us further in a better direction, either be it the social, how do we uplift societal inequality, but also how do we holistically manage businesses and civil society to better collaborate with each other, but as well as the economic resilience in lifting up the baseline of the vulnerable people from and also giving them more capacity to deal with something that they might not have a chance to. But I think moving on to John as well, the other connection to that is how do we start looking at cities and infrastructures in a way that, you know, something that could be systematically managed. But in order to manage those, we really need to understand and assess the capacity of resources and how we manage the flows of whatever goes into the city in order to make it a balanced call, right? So I think that that is a very good kind of input to how we start looking at how to shift into a paradigm where we talk about cities in relationship with the carrying capacity of the world and even the earth system. So when we look at risk from your perspective, it's not just about, well, we talk about city, but we're not talking about city as an individual entity, right? We're talking about cities as an interconnected dots around the world and how we could co-create and manage resources so that the carrying capacity and the earth system are also sustainable for the long run. So I think that's a very huge undertake and also a very exciting segue into the future of how the world, and not even just one single city, actually started to think about risk. And I think for Miho, this is a very collective, I think it's a great bridge because we see a very holistic view from the global and international perspective. But Miho really brought us back to the ground, right? How we start talking about the world and how we really bridge or put it back on the ground. Who are people who are operating this? Who will be the active users? Who will be the active change makers of these risks, right? We have to start from the community. We have to start from an individuals in order to do it collectively and then spreading it out and then grows bigger as we go. But of course, all of that needs technology, but also our decision on how we're going to use technology to really benefit and uplift the social well-being, but also the social cohesion through that technology. So I think all of this is a vast and complex domain, but I really appreciate that, you know, all of us have a very different, diverse perspective here. I think I'm going to end from the conclusion from my part and the perspective that I think the building stronger social and cultural capital will be the underlying infrastructure of resilience capacity as well. And this requires time. We just can't build resilient society now or next year, but it's required time, right? To build and also using education, raising awareness and communication constantly to make risk or mainstreaming risk as an everyday new normal, as John has said. And for this, I think institutions and governments has a major role to play. And they may need to, even may becoming more agile facilitators to enable this resilience yet inclusive development for the future. So I think I'm going to wrap my conclusion and thoughts that I think that I love all the discussion today and hearing a different perspective, but also I think we're all leading at the same end goal. So applauding to everyone and also Punata so for such very good questions for each of the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Even though we are on virtual, but we can clap our hands, give big hands to all the speakers. Thank you very much, Kun Pichapa, for your excellent wrapping up of the whole webinar discussion. And I'd like to extend our gratitude and appreciation to all speakers from Stefano, Professor John, Professor Miho, for sharing your thoughts and your view on your research. That's so valuable to encourage the whole society, international community to build up resilient society to face the risk future and the world of uncertainty. And thank you for all audience for keep watching us. And we are welcome for any feedback. You can use QR code and send feedback. And don't forget to follow IPPD page and click like so you won't miss any webinar discussion for the future. And on behalf from Thai PBS and Thai PBS World, I'd like to thank you for all involved in this webinar discussion. And Dr. Sorapop has been back as well. Thank you very much for IPPD effort to arrange this seminar. So thank you for you all to have been watching, and until we meet next time. Bye for now.